All right, admitting everyone now.
All right, Sam, do we have everyone in?
We're good to go.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody. There'll be more trickling in as we get moving here, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time. First of all, I want to thank a lot of the HOA leaders that we've been dialoguing with, and their recommendation was to hold this at noon today to make sure we could get as many people as possible, as convenient as possible. So this will be recorded, and we will share this out to the community afterwards with as well as some of our questions that we hope to answer. For those of you that are new to this conversation, my name is Scott Fatness, by the way. I'm the mayor here in the city of Fishers. And we've been having this dialogue for the better part of a couple of years, talking about how we can thoughtfully go about regulating our single family rental product in the city of Fishers. As we saw from a housing study, that number had grown significantly. And we had heard from a number of neighborhoods that were concerned about this issue. And so we've really tried to be as thoughtful as possible over the last year and a half and come up with a solution that doesn't create a great deal of bureaucracy, but does ensure that none of our neighborhoods get to a point of saturation on rentals that we've heard time and time again from people who live there, have spent their life savings, want to ensure that that neighborhood keeps its integrity and its vibrancy for the long term. Today is really meant to be informative, to walk through the administrative process as well as some of the components of the policy. We've got a lot of questions from different folks in the community, and we hope to answer as many of those as possible today. Alexander has been living this for the better part of a year, working through the process, and so she's going to be able to answer a great deal of those questions today. So again, I want to thank everyone for being a part of this conversation today. I will note we are not voting on this. It's not on the agenda for Monday night. We are planning to bring this forward for a public hearing in April's council meeting. So that's an important point for the folks on the call today, that it'll be an April public hearing for this ordinance. So be sure to get as much information as you can today, gather your facts. We look forward to engaging in the process throughout the next 30 to 45 days. And I'll turn it over now to Jordan to walk us through the process and hopefully answer a lot of questions.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, yeah, kind of like the mayor was saying. So to date, we have had, just to give everyone a little background, 2 public presentations on this proposed ordinance. That includes a work session at City Council and then a first reading of the ordinance last month. And then to the mayor's point, we will be bringing this back in April for a second reading, and there'll also be a public comment period during that meeting as well. So for today's meeting, however, we will be discussing the ordinance and kind of the mechanics of the ordinance, and then answer some of the questions. A lot of questions were submitted beforehand, so thank you for all of those. So we'll go through those. And if you do have additional questions, we do have a smart sheet set up, so that's available. I think Samantha will be able to put it in the chat, but it's fishers.in.gov /rental registration. So if you go to that, you'll be able to actually submit questions if they're not answered through this presentation or through the Q&A. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I did just want to provide a little background for everyone. So we talked about this in work session, but right now Fishers has just over 2,500 suspected rentals here in Fishers, which is about 8% of all of our single family homes in Fishers and about 30% of all rental units in Fishers. So not an insignificant segment of the rental housing market here. In a 2022 housing study, which this study really spurred a lot of this conversation and interest from City Council. But in that study, our consultant found really increasing numbers of single family rentals entering the market and projected that this number would continue to increase as some of these older single family homes in our community kind of phase into rental status over the next 10, 20 years. And that's really just reflective of the life cycle of communities and what many communities throughout the country experience as segments of their housing market age. But again, it's all to say that we do anticipate a continual increase of single family rentals here in Fishers over the coming years. We did pull kind of the ownership breakdown of single family rentals here in Fishers. So of that number, we have just under 50% of that ownership being out of state landlords, and about 25% being these larger institutional investors that own 1,000 or more units throughout the country. So those are the larger investors there. And to just give you an idea of where we stand nationally, so nationally, about 3.8% of single family rentals are owned by institutional investors. So we are at a little bit higher percentage there here locally as well. And then one just final note on the background, as many of you know, the city to date has not had any type of registry or inventory on single family rental product. And really on that note, without a rental registry or inventory, the city has really been in kind of a reactive position when it's come to ensuring quality of this pretty significant segment of the rental market. So particularly, like I said, as we see some of these, older homes currently owner occupied enter rental status, in addition to these increasing numbers of out-of-state ownership and some of these investor ownership numbers, really is going to be imperative that the city is more proactive if we want to maintain this high quality rental stock. So like I said in the work session, rental stock is no doubt an important piece of our housing market, but I think quality is key there, not just for the tenants, obviously, but also for the community. And this is an element that really can be challenged by some of these trends that we're seeing in terms of ownership and increasing number of rentals. So that's kind of one critical piece that we discussed in work session. The other piece to this is single family homeownership and those opportunities. So as many know, homeownership is really one of the best ways for individuals to build wealth. It provides opportunities for individuals to not just invest in the community, but in its vibrancy as well. And homeowners, are obviously investing in the improvement of their property as well, which increases the value of entire communities. So for a community that already has a pretty competitive single family market, it really is going to be important that the city is proactive in balancing some of these homeownership opportunities along with rental opportunities in our communities. So those are kind of the overarching challenges here that we have discussed through public meetings so far. Obviously, there's many downstream impacts as well, but these are kind of the areas that the city is really seeking to be proactive with when it comes to this or the ordinance and then the registration itself. So with all this considered and what we're here to discuss today, this ordinance is proposing a rental registration program along with a rental permit cap. So now we'll get into kind of describing what all of that means and how that looks in this ordinance. So as I mentioned, there's really two parts to the ordinance. So on one hand, you have the registration and permitting requirement, which will essentially require all single family rental units, including townhomes, to register for a permit in order to operate as a single family rental here in Fishers. Permits will not expire until there's an ownership changeover or unless the permit is revoked, which we'll talk about here in a bit. The other piece of this is the rental permit cap. And this essentially would implement a cap of 10% at the subdivision level. So essentially, permits will only be issued 2 units if there exists less than that 10% of home rental unit permits in a subdivision. I will note, which there were a lot of questions on this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But we do have a proposed provision for legacy rentals, which essentially says any rental existing prior to December 31st of this year would not be subject to that 10% cap. And again, that's until there's an ownership changeover and that permit expires. But in other words, we're not going into neighborhoods that are at 30% and saying, hey, you can't be rentals anymore, you have to go down to this. So if you're at a 30% number, those would essentially be grandfathered in if established prior to that December 31st date. So in terms of start date, we would be looking at a January 1st of next year, so 2026. This would really be the date that all single family rentals would need to be registered. And then that's the date that enforcement would commence, which we'll talk about enforcement on the next slide. We did put a lot of thought into exceptions as well, based on council feedback and what we had heard from HOAs. These are detailed in the ordinance itself, but I will say, or I'll just run through these kind of at a high level. So if you're renting to family or legal dependents, you're exempt from this ordinance. If you've been relocated for a job, also exempt for this ordinance if you're planning to rent that and come back to Fishers. Or similarly, if you're deployed military and need to rent out your house, you are also exempt from this ordinance. We did add 2 additional exceptions since our last, since we had met. Actually, we talked about these in the first reading, but these were added since the work session. But these include both an undue burden clause, which essentially covers specific instances like death or divorce that would prevent selling of a property. So those situations would be exempt. And then the last kind of exemption here would be any property that is listed for 6 months or longer in the last year, but have failed to sell in that period of time, that would be exempt as well. So we really tried to keep these exceptions inclusive of situations that could arise. But as with any of our permitting processes, there would be the ability to appeal a permit denial. So if your situation was not included in these exceptions, that would require an appeal, which we'll talk about that process here in a second. So in terms of compliance and enforcement, like we've discussed, the technology that we're leveraging is really critical to make or to actually enforce this ordinance, which we will talk about in a couple slides, as it really is providing that like real-time data to identify rentals and those new rentals as they enter the market. I will say from an enforcement perspective, there will be a fine schedule for non-compliance. So if you fail to register by that January 1st date or 30 days after actually acquiring a rental and renting it out, you could be subject to the $250 fee for failing to register. But if you're actually operating knowingly and renting a home and you're above that 10% cap, in that situation, the property owner would be subject to a $1,000 fine. And that can actually escalate to no less than $5,000 and no more than $7,500. So like I mentioned in the first reading, this fee schedule really contemplates a situation where, let's say a property owner is over 10%, but they're already renting to a family or a tenant. In this situation, the city would not be putting itself in a position where we would be evicting a current tenant or a family. However, the property would be subject to a fine under this schedule. And then if the property owner continued to rent after that initial lease ended, then they would be subject to kind of that escalation fine. And then continued non-compliance after that point, as noted in the ordinance, would elevate to the city court. I did want to note just like the notice of violation process as well. So outside of registering, additional violations which could result in a permit being revoked include violations to code enforcement violations, more than 7 public nuisance calls, and then utility delinquency as well. So after the notice of violation in these cases, if these are not corrected, owners could be subject to that permit revocation, which again would occur by the way of the city court. But again, it would be the intent of city staff that we would work with the property prior to actually initiating that revocation process. Oh, and then one final note on here, I did just want to note the appeals process. So like I mentioned earlier, with any city permit or notice of violation, property owners do have the right to appeal that decision. So the appeals process would go through, again, Fishers City Court, and really seeking an objective decision there. So I do just want to touch on the requirements of the registration itself. Most of what we're requiring here is really logistical information, including a local contact. So I've mentioned this before, but a really critical piece for both code enforcement and public safety is having a local contact. So many times when we try to deal with code enforcement issues or have a public safety issue, it's really difficult to get a hold of a property owner, specifically when they're located out of state. So this is one piece that we're definitely including in here. But again, not requiring a lease to be uploaded, insurance, or any of that. It really is a lot of logistical information. In terms of the registration process itself, there will be obviously more information to come on this process, but essentially property owners would fill out an application through the rental registry. We'll have a landing page on our website with all this information. But the software that we're utilizing, which we'll discuss on the next slide, will really confirm if that property is under the 10% permit cap and then in compliance with property code, utility payments, and then those public nuisance calls that I mentioned, and then issue the permit. So if there's flags on any of those, then that's where planning and zoning, our team would be involved in more of a manual review, and depending on the criteria that we're in non-compliance. So like I said, I did just want to touch on the technology piece of this and kind of the mechanics of this whole process. So really when we were researching registration programs that were out there, really the biggest hindrances to other programs out there were in the technology. So, you know, if you're thinking about identifying rentals outside of really manual data pulls, that would take a lot of staff time or be nearly impossible. It really, without a software, it's difficult to, again, identify those rentals in real time. And then secondly, to actually ensure the registration is actually being completed. So the software we're utilizing now and we'll be able to utilize for this program really aggregates information from a variety of county data, rental listings, and to a high degree of certainty can identify suspected rentals in the community. And again, in real time, identify when there's changeover or additional rentals coming online. And then on the other hand, it can actually ensure the registration and compliance of those rentals. So this same software also supports the registration and application itself. So all components of the registration will be online and managed through the software that actually identifies the suspected rentals. And then one last thing I just wanted to note, because I know there were a lot of questions about this, but this technology that we are utilizing will allow any prospective landlords to actually identify whether a property is available for rent and allow for kind of a temporary permit to be issued to allow that prospective landlord to close on a property prior to applying for kind of the longer term permanent permit for that property. So this is a really important feature as it does reduce some of those barriers to prospective landlords that are interested in moving forward with purchasing a rental property, but really needing that real-time verification whether that property is available for rent. So that is a critical feature of this software as well. And then finally, I do just want to talk about timeline. I know we discussed it a little bit at the start of this meeting. As we discussed, we already have had 2 public meetings at City Council, including that work session in January, first reading in February. We obviously are having this webinar today, which we will post all of these slides and the Q&A on our website after this meeting. We'll also be meeting with HOAs this week through the HOA Alliance. And then we do plan to bring this back in April for that second reading and public comment period as well, which will be specifically for this ordinance. And then really depending when the ordinance is finally approved, we would be looking at a go live for the registry around probably like the end of May or June, which would really allow for at least a 6-month transition period for property owners to get registered. So we would also use this time for additional HOA outreach, notice letters to property owners, We do intend to continue to meet with realtors and title companies to educate on the change. And like I said, that proposed go live date for enforcement, when everyone would need to actually be registered, would be on January 1st of 2026, so next year. And then, yeah, one final note, we will again include the Q&A on our website. And as we get closer to an actual final ordinance, we'll make more information readily available, because right now it is constantly changing. And again, we've only had a first reading, so a lot of these conditions are still subject to change. So just one note there. And then with that, I think we can switch to Q&A, which I know Samantha's going to be sending me the real-time Q&A, and then I have all of the questions that were submitted prior or during sign up for the webinar, so I can start going through those. These up. And there were a lot of the same questions, so I did try to condense these as much as possible. But again, if you feel like your question was not answered, please submit those to the Smartsheet. So, okay, I will just be running through these here quickly. So first one, will the Augusta rule be an exception that will be applied? So I talked with our city attorneys on this. From my understanding, the Augusta rule actually only applies to taxable income. So this ordinance does not impact this IRS rule in any way. So that's a separate rule there. How will you ensure all properties are registered? We kind of touched on this, but like I said, the software technology that we're utilizing will track that registration. And as I discussed, that software actually identifies the rentals in our community and then manages that registration component as well. I will just note here as well, because I know it's going to be another question on here, but the data that is pulled from the county to actually identify these suspected rentals. So it pulls from homestead exemptions on the property, whether the property is owner occupied, whether the property tax mailing address is different than that home address. And then we're also able to pull from various listings like Zillow, Redfin, some of those as well. So, but again, it tracks all of those real time, which is really critical for us to be able to track and enforce this ordinance. So what would the process be to obtain a new rental approval, and how would a local investor be able to timely access neighborhood percentages when considering buying? So like I mentioned on the last slide, the technology we're utilizing will allow any prospective landlords to essentially identify whether a property is available for rent. So you would go on, again, to the landing page, type in the address. If it's over the 10%, it'll essentially like stop you in your tracks right there and indicate this is not available. If it's under that 10% and available for rent, you would type in some preliminary info, be issued a temporary permit, and then that would be good for, I believe we have it set for like 90 days to allow you to actually close on the property. And then you would go to apply for that longer term permanent permit. So that temporary permit would essentially kind of like hold your place in line to be able to rent that property. But again, this reduces a lot of those barriers that could be there without this technology. How do I know if any houses are already being rented? And I think they're asking about the appeals process. So I know there's been a lot of questions from HOAs on how can they work with the city to know what rentals are registering in their community. So we can definitely work on identifying a process for notifying HOAs upon registration of rentals. And then in terms of the appeals process, as with any of our permits, like I said, a property owner could appeal a decision if they were denied a permit or they didn't qualify for an exception. So we already touched on that. Will this go into effect? Already answered that. So how will the city enforce compliance with the registry to track rentals? Are there exceptions to the rental cap? I'll touch on the exceptions again here, because we already talked about kind of compliance and enforcement there. But again, like I said, I'll just reiterate this. If you're renting to family or legal dependents, you're exempt. Job relocation. So if you can't sell your home in a certain amount of time to be able to be relocated for your job, or if you just simply want to rent that because you plan to come back to Fishers, that's exempt. We already talked about the military exemption. And then, yeah, the undue burden clause, which again, if there's a life event that really prevents you from selling that property, that's an exemption as well. And then, like we said, over 6 months, if you're on, if your property is up for sale for over 6 months, that would also be an exception. So what happens to landlords who don't register? We talked about this on the enforcement piece, but landlords who do not register, you'd first be subject to that $250 fine. And if you're actually operating without a permit over that 10%, that's where that $1,000 fine would come into play. And then per this ordinance as it's currently proposed, that could escalate to that range in between $5,000 and no more than $7,500. So in terms of the fine schedule, we did make it steep. A lot of the research we did on some of these registries that have failed in other parts of the country, it really has been due to enforcement. So we wanted to ensure that the ordinance does have enough teeth to actually make this effective. Will there be a town hall for residents? We have had, like I said, the 2 public meetings already. We are having this one now for questions. There will be, again, another second reading in April, and that's where that public hearing, public comment will be to actually speak specifically on this ordinance. So those are the opportunities as well. There's always a scenario where it comes back for a 3rd reading as well. So those are currently the opportunities to provide public comment. How will this affect second homes? Currently, I own a second home in Fishers, and my primary home is out of state. So this will not impact second homes. I know people that are snowbirds have brought this up to me. So if you're a snowbird that just lives here part of the year, you will not be subject to this ordinance as it only applies to rentals. I will say we are generally through the software able to differentiate between second homes and rentals through that criteria that I mentioned. But if there was a scenario where you were mistakenly identified as a rental, there will be a correction process through the city as well. This says one HOA submitted that they had an exception that if we lived in our place as our primary residence for at least 1 year, we'd be exempt to the cap. So we currently do not have language in the ordinance for exceptions if you've owned a home more than a year. And that's primarily because it still doesn't really address some of the concentration issues that we're trying to address with some of these neighborhoods that have 30, 40, 50% rentals. So currently, no, there are no exceptions in the ordinance as it stands today for that. Someone asked if we're bringing this back in March. No, it's not coming back to council in March. This ordinance is coming back in April for a second reading along with public comment. Had a question on why the number, so there was a rental number that we pulled in 2023. Why is that different than the suspected rental number now? So I'll say in 2023, we were pulling all that information manually. That was before we had this software that we're utilizing now. So I will say that number that we had initially pulled in 2023 was primarily based on homestead exemptions, I believe. So since then, we really have done due diligence to better refine our data. Again, we've identified this software that's able to better pull some of these data sources to really identify rentals to that higher degree of certainty that I was mentioning. And also note that I think this will continue to be kind of a process of refinement as we identify suspected rentals and then actually open a registry. Data can get you so far on suspected rentals, but then there will be kind of that manual refinement piece that the registration will actually address to confirm rentals. Can you limit, someone asked if you can limit the number of rental houses as a percentage by a neighborhood. So that's what we'll be doing. So this is at the subdivision level. So just to give some more clarity on what subdivision means. So when a plat is established, or I think it's actually through the secondary plat, parcels are tied to a subdivision. If you go onto our city's GIS or the county GIS, any property you pull up, or I shouldn't say any, there's probably about 98% that you pull up will be tied to a subdivision. And that subdivision is what we are basing the 10% off. And I will also note that this only applies to subdivision with 10 or more parcels, since we're proposing a 10% cap. Anything less than that, you would be limiting less than a full parcel. Had another HOA question on how they can actually access this data. So again, we'll work on a process with HOAs on communicating this information. I will say publicly, once we get the registration piece under our belt and we're into next year, if all of this moves forward, there will be a dashboard of kind of aggregated rental properties in that data, but we do hope to have something more specific, I think, for HOAs, since I know a lot of HOAs are also trying to manage rentals within their neighborhoods. Does every, what is this? So if this is passed, does it apply to every neighborhood in Fishers? Yes, this would apply to all incorporated subdivisions, like I said, over those 10 parcels in Fishers. And I saw another question on whether it applies to unincorporated. No, as with all of our ordinances, they only apply to incorporated parcels. Another question on who will monitor and enforce this. So as we've kind of discussed in different ways, planning and zoning will be monitoring and enforcing this, but it will be that combination between kind of the automated registration and permitting, and then a manual review by planning and zoning. And then, like I said, on appeals or revoking a permit, the city court would be involved. So that's kind of the varying levels of enforcement. Someone asked why, or that this appears to be a zoning ordinance, why wouldn't it go through plan commission? So this is not actually a zoning ordinance. That's a good point. This is not a zoning ordinance, and Indiana code actually gives us the ability to issue rental permits in this way. And I have that referenced, I think, on one of my presentations to council, what Indiana code that is that allows for the rental registry and the permitting. Unincorporated, no, or I already answered the unincorporated question, that this does not apply to unincorporated properties. So will there be any exceptions for non-corporate landlords? So again, the only administrative exceptions we have currently are the ones I've ran through and that are on this presentation. Another HOA similarly was asking about how we make sure owners register the homes they rent out. So again, we plan to work pretty closely with HOAs, even through this if we are able to move forward with all of this, like through the transition period, to work with them closely to ensure that they are able to educate their property owners as well on the registration component. They also asked how we can encourage new owners not to rent. Again, I think this ordinance, that's really the intent, is to work closely with the HOAs. I know some HOAs have more restrictive covenants than what we're proposing through this ordinance. Those more restrictive covenants will actually be able to trump anything the city's doing. But again, we'll work with HOAs throughout this process. So another HOA noted that it has been very difficult. They've passed a rental cap amendment within their HOA. And one of their biggest challenges has been enforcement and actually determining which houses are rentals. So we have discussed this with a lot of different HOAs that have attempted to put in rental permits. Like I said, without the technology that we're actually going to be able to leverage for this, it really is a pretty big administrative burden. And so it is difficult for a lot of HOAs to actually track those. So that's where I think the city introducing this ordinance can really help a lot of those HOAs that have attempted to implement some of these covenants, but been unsuccessful just from the administrative challenges and the staff load that it can require without a software. Does the new rental ordinance apply to townhomes or condominium neighborhoods? So yes, this will apply to townhomes and condominiums. Essentially, as it says in the ordinance, any property that owns its own lot, tract, or parcel of real estate. So that language is in the ordinance itself. Someone wanted to explain the grandfathering in detail, please. So this is going back to the legacy rentals that we discussed. So I'll reiterate this, but the grandfathering detail essentially means that, like I said, any rental established prior to that December 31st of this year would not be subject to the rental permit cap until there was a changeover of ownership on that property. So these legacy properties would still be required to register, receive the permit. However, they would just not be subject to the cap. So in other words, like I said, if you have a rental in a neighborhood that's already over 30%, you'd be able to keep that rental until that ownership changes, and then that permit would sunset, and the new owner would actually have to apply for a permit. And then that would then be subject to that 10% cap. And if the neighborhood was over that 10%, that new permit would be denied. I touched on this, but another HOA had asked how their current rental restriction covenant would be affected. So HOA rental restrictions, like I said, can be more stringent than the city ordinance. So I know, like I mentioned, we do have a lot of neighborhoods with tighter restrictions or ones that limit it completely. Those can still be in place. This ordinance from the city really just provides a baseline for some of those HOAs that do not have a rental cap, or, like I said, have not been able to enforce a rental cap due to some of those administrative limits. Or we've talked to a lot of HOAs where in some of the larger neighborhoods where it's really just hard to get attendance for votes at board meetings, and they've been unable to pass some of these. So that's where this city ordinance comes into play as kind of a baseline there. Will the ordinance include anything other than registering? So like I said, it does include the registration component and then the permit cap piece. So there's really two pieces that this ordinance includes. Oh, I do want to touch on, so there's a lot of questions on short-term rentals, and we do have Ross, our Director of Planning and Zoning, on here. Ross, do you just want to touch on, one, how this doesn't apply to short-term rentals, but also what the process looks like for short-term rentals in Fishers?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. So current state statute, I think back to 2018, really did limit municipalities on regulation of short-term rentals. And what a short-term rental is, in both our definition and the state's definition, is any rental property, single family, condo, townhome, that seeks to rent the property for 30 days or less. And that is owner occupied. So that means that, I own my home and I rent it out for the weekend, or buy a room on common sites like Vrbo or Airbnb. That is what a short-term rental is. This would not be applied to any of those. But what we do have already in our code is short-term rentals that are non-owner occupied. And those already require going before our Board of Zoning Appeals. And they seek what's called a special exception to allow pretty much that home occupation or the ability to rent their home as a short-term rental and not be an owner, not be owner occupied. So it's kind of the definition, but this does not affect short-term rentals.
Thank you, Ross. I know that's been a point of clarification a lot of people have wanted. Will the city enforce the rules and the covenants that cover noise and modifications to the exterior of the home? I think this might be getting at like the public nuisance conversation and code enforcement. So, like I discussed, the ordinance does indicate that good standing with a rental permit, or the criteria that the permit is actually issued, would be based on that code enforcement compliance, public nuisance call compliance, and then utility delinquency, or lack thereof, I should say. So yes, this criteria, I think if I understand the question correctly, this criteria of noise and modifications to the exterior of the home would be covered under this ordinance. So how will the city investigate and determine if it is a rental? Again, I'll refer back to this technology piece. So like I said, the technology does utilize a variety of those data points that I mentioned, including that homestead exemption or lack thereof, whether the property is owner occupied, whether the property's address is different than the property tax mailing address, and then whether there have been active listings. So through this criteria, like I said, we can determine to a high degree of certainty, which properties are rentals. And so that is kind of the criteria which we determine that. Will the city be using citizen complaints as notification of rentals? No. So citizen complaints, I mean, like with code enforcement complaints, we review them, but we do not consider them legitimate until, those have been reasonably confirmed, or in this case, that criteria above that I mentioned, that we use to actually identify a suspected rental have been met. So again, just like with code enforcement, citizens can submit complaints, but those are not valid complaints until they've been confirmed by city staff. I'll just touch on this one more time because a couple people did ask this specifically. Wouldn't it be better to just allow each HOA to pass individual covenants to restrict rental units versus having it on a citywide basis? So like I mentioned, I mean, we've had a lot of conversations with HOAs over the years on this matter. And as we've discussed in some of the council meetings that we've had so far, some HOAs have been able to successfully pass ordinances and enforce ordinances to limit rentals. However, for many other neighborhoods, particularly some of those that are the larger neighborhoods, like I mentioned, that it's difficult to get votes, or some neighborhoods where HOAs have just like completely gone defunct, and there are challenges in actually passing an ordinance. It's really difficult to enforce at the HOA level. So like I said, the city is bringing in this ordinance kind of as the baseline. If HOAs have more stringent covenants they want to enforce, that's great. That trumps the city ordinance. But again, this is kind of the baseline for those HOAs that have exhausted all other solutions to this problem. this is another exemption question. So how does this impact my ability to rent out a house I own if I have to move for work, but I intend to return in 2 years? Again, the exemption for work-related, there is an exemption for work-related relocation. So that situation is granted an exception to both the registration and the permitting cap. Someone just asked where the data for the number of rentals in our prior reports and presentation articles have came from. Like I said, the data that we showed today on that first slide is from the aggregated county data that I've mentioned a few times now, and what that software that we're utilizing is able to actually pull. So that's where we're able to get that list of suspected rentals. Could you create a website that realtors can go to see restrictions on rentals so they can inform buyers? So that's our intent. If we do move forward with this ordinance, that we would have an entire page dedicated to the registry and information around the registry. So that is the intent with this program. Is there HOA question? Someone had asked previously, what is the database problem for, or that the rental cap is designed to solve? So kind of like I mentioned at the start of this presentation, but that 2022 housing study that I referenced really had a plethora of information regarding single family rentals in Fishers and some of those trends that we're seeing. Like I noted, a lot of this conversation was born out of that study. And as I discussed, you know, to date, the city is really in a reactive state without this ordinance when it comes to this pretty large and, again, what was projected from that housing study, growing segment of our rental housing market. So again, I would say this ordinance really just seeks to proactively address, again, some of those quality issues and then that balancing of rental opportunities with these home ownership opportunities in Fishers. Had a handful of comments on property rights and how those are implicated. So I'll just note that, I mean, even with this ordinance, the property, you're still able to use this property for, or single family property for its intended purpose, which is a single family home. And the city is not taking away value or use of that property. You can still get that value out of the home with its original intended use and sale of that property. So that would be my response on the property rights subject. Will there be a limit on how many rentals any given corporation can own in Fishers? Not a limit on how many a corporation can own, but they will. There's another part to this question on will they be responsible for the condition? Yes, they will be responsible for the condition of the property. And that's what this ordinance is trying to actually enforce and hold property owners accountable for the condition of their property. I want to make sure I have time to get to the questions that are in the smart sheet. A lot of HOA questions on whether covenants will, if their covenants will trump city ordinance. Yes, if they are more stringent. Someone noted they were curious if this ordinance would keep people out of Fishers who are not able to buy a home yet and still need a place to live. I will note something that I didn't bring up. So we have just under 30% of our entire housing market that is rental product. And so that's right, what you kind of see nationally is that 30% number. So, I mean, there are opportunities for renters in Fishers. I mean, but like the, you know, high demand that there is for home ownership, there's always going to be a competitive market for rentals as well. And this city council and administration has been really intentional about rental product and ensuring that we do have enough of it. But again, there's always going to be a competitive market here, whether it's homeownership or rental product. Can more pressure be placed on rental companies to at least mow regularly? I would say that that is one intention of this ordinance. Again, right now it's really difficult to actually enforce code issues on rental properties. Like I said, a lot of times we don't even have a local contact. And where we can fine on code enforcement when there's not a permit contingent on compliance with code enforcement, it's very difficult to enforce. So that's one thing we're trying to address on this. Okay, I'm gonna switch over to some of these smart sheet questions real quick. What will the cost of the permit be? There is no cost with the permit. Per state statute, you can actually charge $5 if you want. We will not be charging anything. How will city, some of the investors have been found? I'm not sure what that one is asking. Who's determining what hardship qualifies as hardship? So as with all the exceptions, they are listed first and foremost as administrative exceptions. So that will first be determined by planning and zoning. If it's something outside of their discretion or they're unable to determine, then that is where it can actually go to the city court for a more objective lens. Do the properties that qualify as an exemption count towards a 10% cap? No, they do not. Our association has 4 separate neighborhoods under the one association. Will the 10% apply to the entire association or to each neighborhood? That's probably a question I would have to answer one off. I would have to see which subdivision you're in. Some neighborhoods we see actually have subdivisions within a larger subdivision. In those cases, each of those would be subject to the 10% cap. But some neighborhoods are all under one subdivision, like Avalon, for instance, where their plat is tied to one subdivision name. So that would be that whole subdivision would be at the 10%. So that'll be a specific answer depending on what subdivision you're in. It was identified. It was identified in the webinar that the problem is primarily out-of-state investors and institutional investors. Why not only limit them? Why deal with the problem and not limit residents? So that's definitely one component of this, I would say. We are not targeting specific groups through this ordinance, as in that scenario, you get into a discrimination situation. I will note that one of the biggest pieces we are looking to kind of address or stop the bleeding are for some of these neighborhoods where there is 30, 40, 50% rentals. And in those, it really is a mixture of these institutional investors and smaller investors as well. So even if we were able to only limit these institutional investors or out-of-state investors, it really wouldn't be addressing that core issue, which is the concentration issue in some of these neighborhoods that are, again, 30, 40, 50% rental and have been essentially taken over by rental properties. And Samantha, have you guys been answering? I keep hearing stuff in the chat. I haven't been looking at that at all. I'm only looking at the smart sheet right now. So if there's anything else in there.
I've been moving things over or answering if it's something that I can answer, or Ashley. We've been
Okay.
answering those, and then anything else I've been moving over into the same chat with you. So
Okay. Has the city looked at allowing current owners to be allowed to rent for retirement purposes, a source of income in retirement? We have not yet. Again, the only exceptions are those that we have mentioned so far. Again, this is the first version of the ordinance, so that is still subject to change. That's something we can discuss with council as well. How will the cities try to keep up on who controls the LLCs? Some of the mega investors have been found to move property between their LLCs to avoid detection. So this is actually another pretty cool feature of this software. They're able to identify a lot of these shell companies. So even when they're under different LLCs, the software essentially tells us like where those tie back to. So again, that's something without the software and without the technology that would be very difficult to actually keep up on. Why is this but not better addressed at the HOA level in each community? I think I already touched on this one. We've talked to a lot of HOAs where they just simply cannot actually enforce, or potentially in some neighborhoods actually get enough people to show up to their board meeting to get the votes. So again, this is kind of that baseline ordinance, which helps some of those HOAs that have been unsuccessful in implementing rental covenants, but have still been pushing for rental covenants for years and trying to slow down the progression of rentals in their neighborhoods. Is there a plan to address code enforcement? So is there a plan to step up relations with HOAs and to assist them with code or with enforcement for problematic homes? Again, like I said, we do plan to work closely with the HOAs through this transition period. I think there will have to be brainstorming on how we work together to, one, communicate rentals that are registering and being able to communicate those with the HOAs. But we definitely will be working together as well on like the enforcement piece and also the code enforcement piece. So I would say, yes, there is a plan, but we would plan to continue to iron that out before the actual enforcement date next year on January 1st. I know. I know the rental amendment we have. Oh, okay, this is from an HOA. So they're essentially saying if their HOA covenant trumps like the Fisher's ordinance, how will we flag the subdivision in the database so they cannot get, we do have the ability to actually flag them through this ordinance. So if there is an HOA, again, we're only enforcing what our ordinance indicates, but again, with the intention of working closely with the HOAs, we can flag those neighborhoods that have more stricter covenants and stay in communication with the HOA if there are people applying above those HOA covenants. And I think there was one more. So what does this ordinance do to impact neighborhoods that are already 30, 40, 50% rentals? So again, the ones that are already well above the 10%, those are going to be kind of grandfathered in as these legacy rentals. So those very well could stay at those higher percentages for some years because again, there would have to be ownership changeover for those permits to expire. Again, the intent with this ordinance is to really stop the bleeding in some of those neighborhoods that are at such high percentages already. But there's not much that we can do to go say, hey, you're an existing rental and now you can't be a rental. Those are going to be, and I don't think we want to do that either, but those will be grandfathered in. All right. Okay, well, I think that was all of the questions from the Smart Sheet. I know, Sam, you were answering some through the chat as well. Like I said, I will post this presentation along with the Q&A. There will be more to come as we get closer to an actual final ordinance. Like I said, this is the first version of this ordinance. We will eventually have a whole landing page and a whole landing page where all of this will live, the registration and all of the associated information as well. But like I said, next council meeting where this will be brought up will be April council meeting. And there will be a public comment period as well. So with that, thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, we'll post this recording for anyone who wasn't able to attend. Thank you all.